How's it going, everybody? Welcome to this week's recorded Lumix Live session. As we've talked about last week, we're recording these sessions so that we've got a little bit of time as we have been originally planning for CES. But this stream is really going to be a follow-up to last week's feature discussion. We got a ton of questions in the chat, a lot more than I was expecting to see. So we're going to cut through a bunch of those. Originally, I had a whole bunch of stuff planned, but looking at some of the questions that people have been asking, I feel it actually makes more sense to just address these questions, and I'll save the stuff that I have recorded for a future session, or we'll just talk about it live on a different stream. So before we go too far into that, I want to actually give everybody a little bit of an update. We had originally been saying that we were going to be coming to you live from CES all of next week. So Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, we were going to be broadcasting live, 5th, 6th, and 7th. Fortunately and unfortunately, there have been a couple of changes due to the concerns of COVID and the spread and the way just we're a very employee first, kind of making sure everyone's okay and safe. We've made the decision that we're not going to go to the show. At least Matt and I are not going. So instead of doing the original plan where we're going to be broadcasting from the show for 3 days and all that kind of stuff, we'll be doing just our normal Thursday live stream, but we will be talking a lot about some of the cool things that I know are getting announced at the show. So we'll still be talking about, kind of the outside products from Lumix, but we will also still be taking a lot of questions about your Lumix cameras. If you have questions about some of the tech and features and how they can kind of relate to our products, definitely make sure you come and bring those. So it's still going to be a really, really cool stream. Make sure to join us. It's going to be next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We have the link up already, so I'll have that linked at the end of this video. You'll have a card up in the corner as well. So we'll be able to actually get to, still talk about some current events. But yeah, unfortunately, we won't be out in Vegas for the show. Making sure everyone stays safe throughout this, kind of end or beginning of the year. Before we go into the questions, I also want to remind everybody about Lumix Pro Services. We have Lumix Pro Service Red for anybody that has a Lumix camera that qualifies for it. Make sure you go check it out. Get yourself registered here in the United States. LPS Red is free. This is what gets you your 3-year warranty. It has like the whole online program for getting yourself, if you happen to need service, you've got a portal to take care of it. And it also has the ability to upgrade quickly into something like Lumix Pro Platinum. Now, the Platinum tier is the, kind of all-encompassing, pro-level support from us. That gets you, fast turnaround times. It gets you a member's hotline. That 3-year warranty is continued as well. Nice member gift, all that kind of fun stuff. So if you're someone who really is demanding on your gear and you want to make sure you've got the best level of protection in case something happens, make sure to check out Lumix Pro Platinum. We have those links down in the description below, and we'll have the cards up as well. So outside of that, let's actually kind of jump into this. We've gotten, like I said, a lot of questions last week from everything from video side and into some photo side questions. And instead of just running a bunch of the pre-recorded stuff that I had already had in my head planned, after seeing some of these questions, I wanted to make sure that I got to a lot of them because I know we've talked about some of them, but obviously we didn't maybe necessarily get into them into as much detail as some people wanted, so why not use this opportunity to actually go a little bit deeper into these? So the questions are going to go from things like what luminance level to choose when you're working with something like a Ninja 5, or if you're recording internally, all the way into if you're shooting something, at different distances, is there a way to limit how the lens is focusing? So focus limiters like we used to have on, traditional, full-size lenses that we used to be using. And I've got a tip. There is a way to do it depending on the camera you have. We've also had questions about open gate modes and things like, on the S1H, 420 versus 422, and, whether or not that's something that we think is going to be able to be added into cameras. I will also talk a little bit about APS-C lenses on the full frame cameras and how they can affect and things you need to look out for if you're using an APS-C lens that's either a dumb lens, so it doesn't have any electronic contacts into the camera, or if you're using a lens that does have electronic contacts and you're using it through an adapter. So a couple of things to just kind of pay attention to, and we'll cover some of that information there. Um, then we've also got a question about i.Dynamic, which I know we've talked about a little bit before, but I will cover that one again a little bit. And overall, just as a sneak peek, you're probably not going to want to use it if you're in a kind of where you're going to actually want to be working with your footage. If you're shooting in something like, a flatter profile, not vlog, because you can't use it in i.Dynamic. But yeah, we'll talk about i.Dynamic as well. And then lastly, I want to make sure I get to this one, is the main differences between the S1 and the S5. Why would you still buy an S1 in 2021 or 2022 versus the S5? And I've got a lot of answers, because cameras don't boil down to just their spec sheets like a lot of times we end up just looking at. We forget to look at the actual details of a camera instead of just the spec sheet. So with that, let's kick this off and talk about the luminance levels. All right, so when we talk about luminance levels with the Lumix cameras, you'll see that you have a couple of different options depending on the camera that you're in. If it's an 8-bit camera, so typically the mid to low tier G series cameras have 8-bit processing, you'll see that you'll have 0 to 255 or 16 to 235. And ultimately, the way I recommend people kind of judging, when to use this, if you're someone who's just kind of getting into, what are the differences between the two, is know that 0 to 255 is what a computer screen's typically, or what a computer is going to try to handle as an absolute luminance range. If you've gone into Photoshop, you've seen that the RGB colors that you typically work with would be from 0 to 255. And this is great because it means that you're going to get theoretically the most out of the luminance range that's possible. But where it gets tricky is where you're going to be delivering that footage when we talk about video. Since in photography it's 0 to 255, your color space is what you end up really questioning, whether it's sRGB, Adobe RGB, that kind of thing. But that's a different conversation. So from the video side, really you want to look at where your footage is going to live and what that location is looking for. Most things that you'll find are not going to want to take a 0 to 255 or 0 to 1023 if you're shooting in 10-bit. The reason for this is that black levels will clip at different points depending on whether you're sending this out in Rec 709, if you're working in things like HDR, which gets even a little bit more tricky when you look at what is the delivery area for it, how is it going to display on so many different levels of displays. So ultimately, look at where your footage is going to go. 16 to 235, if you're recording internally in the camera, is going to make sure that you're safe for things like YouTube. If you take a video, and you've probably run across this, I think a lot of people have run across this before when you're first getting going. If you take a video that's shot in 0 to 255 in 8-bit or 0 to 1023 in 10-bit, and just load it straight into YouTube, you'll probably notice that your black levels clip way earlier than you had shot them at. And another thing you'll notice is that highlights in some cases will also clip before they actually were in your original shot. So the image can either look way too dark because you're making adjustments, or it's making adjustments to correct for it, and all of your dark shadow areas are just clipped out, or your highlights are going to clip before you expect them to. So different programs offer you different tools to actually compensate for this and make sure that you're exporting in the right kind of luminance range to work with. So the reason we offer the different modes in the cameras is basically so that you've got the choice. The Lumix cameras have always been about, giving you as the creator the choices to use things or not. Things like luminance levels, for a lot of us that do filming or broadcasting or live streaming, having the ability to just flip the camera into 16 to 235 know that, my black levels are going to be where they're supposed to be. My highlights are going to be where they're supposed to be. And I can expose it more on a visual scale instead of necessarily a technically perfect scale. It means that what I'm shooting is what I'm delivering. And the software that I work with, which in this case, OBS, allows me to make sure that I'm looking at, 709 as my export. Like I said, not all cameras are going to have all options. Like I said, there is 0 to 255, 0 to 1023, depending on whether or not you have 10-bit or 8-bit. You'll also have things like 16 to 235 or 64 to 940, I believe. And each of these, you'll notice if you have the range selected that's cutting some of the high end and low end number off, those will make sure that you're recording within that proper space to work with. Now, that's a relatively high-level conversation on it. There are immensely more fine details about luminance levels. And I would honestly defer some of those answers to people that know a lot more about it than I do, and kind of the intricacies as to when you would use it, why you should record certain things certain ways. But if you do look online, there are a lot of very technical explanations why certain broadcast standards require the certain versions of it. So I can't really link to any one in particular, but what I will say is that if you go out and you take a look at some of the different Facebook forum groups, if you check with some of the different ambassadors that we have, like Nick Driftwood, over on the Facebook groups, I know that they've talked a lot about it in detail as to why you would really want to pick one or the other. So yeah, hopefully that gets you enough of an answer to kind of get you started. All right, so here you can see I am in the menus here where I can be selecting what I want my custom function buttons to be. So if I go into FN button set, recording, and I go to, say, my AF on button here in the back, I can look and now select what's called AF on near shift or AF on far shift. So what these modes do is basically allow you to go in and say, I want the focusing system to only focus on distant subjects or focus on close subjects. Now, the way we're doing this with the S cameras, in this case the S5, is not necessarily a distance range like what the question was asked, as being able to actually say like 3 to 5 feet or, anything past, 5 feet and just ignore it. You technically do have that with this mode. It's just not implicit in or explicitly stating 5 feet, 10 feet, whatever distance. But what it does is it tells the autofocus system to focus past. So I would basically say the safest way to think about it is past the halfway distance between where you are and the infinite focus point, or the furthest focus point on the lens. Or in near shift would be going from the halfway distance towards you. So where does this become useful? When you look at how a lot of the cameras normally work, with traditionally being set up for half press the shutter for focus, you would use this mode more as a back button style focusing system. So you would program one button to be near shift and one button to be far shift. So if you're a wildlife photographer and you typically know that you're going to be photographing and focusing at distance, this is where you would use far shift. But at the same time, you could very easily just program in one of the other buttons on the back of the camera just by pressing and holding it. And it's not every single button on the camera can be programmed in for near shift, far shift. So definitely go into the button mapping and you'll see which ones can do it. But you're able to then program so that your back button focusing is no longer just a single push the AF on button and it's just going to run the autofocus. You can tailor it to say, like, I know for this shot, I always know I need to be out at distance, so you want AF on far shift, and that'll make sure that it's going to be ignoring everything close to you. So if you're in, like, good example would be, if you're sitting in, like, a blind, and you've got some foliage in front of you, and you're shooting through that foliage, you want to make sure you're not catching the foliage in focus, just use AF far shift. If something is close to you and it's in that foliage, then you want to make sure you use AF near shift. And for the everyday person that's using the camera, you don't have to necessarily be shooting wildlife and sports and stuff like that. You could very easily use these particular modes in situations that a lot of times you can get cameras tripped up in. So say you're visiting a zoo, or you're visiting, any kind of place where, there's a fence in your way and you want to be able to photograph past the fence. Use AF far shift, and it's going to ignore everything that's close to the camera and just start the focus range out at a far end. So that's the modern way that we're handling AF limiting in the S-series cameras. Some of the G-series cameras do have this. The newer cameras have it. Older cameras probably don't have it and probably won't get it, because I know that it is something that comes with the newer processors, that comes with just the newer generations of the cameras. So be on the lookout. It's going to be in the function menu button, so it's not going to be something that you're going to see as a normal menu option. You go into, like we showed here, you're going to go into your custom function button settings. In this case, I chose my AF on button, and then just scrolled down into one of the two AF selections and picked AF on near shift or AF on far shift. So the next question that we get is, about the S1 and the S1H being able to shoot in open gate, and the fact that the camera is set to record in 420 subsampling. The question we've gotten is, would it be able to be set up to do 422 in a firmware update, or would we be able to do open gate raw out to something like an Atomos Ninja 5 or Blackmagic? And I want to get a little bit of clarified information for some people out there. So we talked about this in previous streams, but since the open gate mode in the S1 and the S1H, and any camera that can shoot in the full aspect ratio, or for that matter, any of our cameras that shoot in the HEVC compression, they are going to be shooting 420 10-bit. And the reason for this is that if you've looked online, and we have talked about this before, and it's actually something that we're probably going to be talking about on the live stream next week, is that working with a 422 10-bit HEVC file, so an H.265 file, is one, incredibly challenging on the hardware that you have in your current computer, and most likely in your next computer. Modern graphics accelerations don't natively support H.265 in 422 10-bit unless you are buying the top tier graphics cards. And even then, it's usually not specifically 422, it's usually jumping right up to 444. So the compression does play a big hand in 420 versus 422 when you're looking at HEVC footage. Truthfully, when it comes with a lot of our cameras, you know that our kind of big goal is about quality and reliability. So being able to actually shoot quality footage that you can reliably edit and is just going to be within a standard that is already set out, not by us, but set by what the industry is running, that's kind of where you get that 420 10-bit HEVC. You can buy, like I use an RTX 3070, and it just chews through the 420 10-bit, HEVC footage, and it works perfectly fine. I got a 2080 Ti in my other computer here, and it works perfectly fine. In cases where they don't work, if the software is not optimized or you've got some challenges with it, that's where you end up leaning on your CPU. And unless you're using a top tier CPU, you're basically going to spend all your time in rendering. There are cameras out there that do shoot 422 10-bit HEVC, but 9 out of 10 times you are having to transcode that footage, which is adding an extra level of time into your workflow between you shooting and actually delivering the footage. So that's one of the reasons why it's 420 10-bit. It's a balance between the really good high quality footage, high enough bit rate, really solid compression, and actually being able to use the file in a pretty straightforward, simple way. If you're shooting, for the second part of the question about can OpenGate come to RAW, I honestly don't have a full answer as to whether or not something like the 3:2 aspect ratio 6K could come to RAW. At the moment, we have the 4K and the anamorphic and the 5.9K that you can do, and those are in 16 by 9 or in 17 by 9. The anamorphic is in 4 by 3. Truthfully, we will bring the question to our engineers to see is 6K OpenGate recording something even possible. But what you got to remember is that when it comes to recording out to external devices, there are multiple companies involved. It's not just, wanting to snap your fingers and say, yep, we're going to be feeding through 6K full, 3:2 aspect ratio in 24 frames out. And just hoping that the device manufacturer makes it. The device has to be able to actually work with it. So you start to look at some of that and see, whether or not it's possible. Is it something that actually can be done? And whether or not those particular devices can actually do it. You also start to look at what the HDMI specs are. Is there enough bandwidth in the actual cable to send the amount of data that you're trying to send over for RAW? Those of you that have been following some of the, kind of HDMI sagas out there, the differences between HDMI 2.0 and 2.1, and now that 2.1 is changing because it's actually 2.0 is part of 2.1, all of this headache causes a lot of kind of confusion as to, well, how much data do you actually need? Is it the 48 gigabit? Is it, the 18 gigabit? What is the connection going on there? So there are a lot of things that go into whether or not you can actually do some of this stuff over HDMI for things like RAW, because RAW sends a lot of data over the HDMI cable. And as early adopters to it noted, you really can't cheap out in HDMI cables when you're looking at, making sure that your professional tool works the way it's supposed to. And by cheap out, I want to make sure that I'm very clear. I do not mean having to buy the most expensive HDMI cable you can buy. A lot of times you're getting ripped off by doing that. But make sure you do your research on HDMI cables and the quality and whether or not they're actually meeting the spec that they say they are, and start looking past a lot of the kind of fluff that gets added into, different claims made by them. There are certain specs that you really want to look for, make sure that it works for it. So it's a little bit of a tangent from the question, but that's kind of why at the moment I don't believe there is a 6K 3:2 OpenGate anamorph or OpenGate RAW out to something like a recorder at this time. And then the third part of the question here, which was, about the S5 and, thinking that an upgrade for full frame high speed would be possible to an Atomos, and that you not seeing that there would be a heat issue there. This is where I will have to just kind of take a step back and say, you don't know. We don't know. I don't know. We're not engineers working on cameras. So to make an assumption that, heat may not be a problem or you don't think heat's a problem, none of us are actually working on these cameras and developing them and doing the engineering behind it. So it's easy for all of us to just kind of say, yeah, fix it in a firmware, add it in here. But that's why there are engineers that are devoted to things like thermal management and image quality and stuff like that. All of these things have to play in together. When you compare to something like an S5 versus an S1H, you're looking at the two far ends of the body design spectrum. You've got the S5, which is designed to be a much more compact, full frame, mirrorless interchangeable lens camera. Then you've got something like the S1H, which is physically designed much closer to a cinema level camera. So active cooling, it's much more, robust in design. It's got a lot more mass to actually sink away heat. So even though they use similar generation sensors, in the aspect that, readout speed and things like that are pretty much the same between them. Just because the S1H can do things that the S1 or the S5 can't, doesn't mean that just a firmware update is going to be able to make those cameras do these things. It would be awesome if that's how it worked. But, truthfully, the S5, for the most part, when you look at what it is, the size, the design of the camera versus what's out there in comparison, it's pretty astonishing that our engineers were able to get what they were able to into this camera with the reliability that they have. And to kind of like the rounded part of this question here, which was about high speed recording. So high speed recording, higher frame rates, things like that, all come down to the HDMI spec that's being used in a lot of cases. And we talked about this about the last question. I don't know off the top of my head, and I've not been able to get in touch with anybody that can give me a very clear answer as to which HDMI protocol or which HDMI connection we're using in a camera like the S5. But ultimately, what you have to look at is, what is, one, the device that you're recording to rated to be able to take frame rate wise over HDMI. If you're someone who is in the computer side of the industry, or pretty much all of us are, you'll know that like computer monitors, you may see like that a monitor may advertise that it can do 144 hertz or 240 hertz. But then you plug your HDMI cable in and you're finding that, none of that is there until you realize that it had to be over DisplayPort. That's because different revisions of HDMI have different frame rate caps at different resolutions. So a lot of that's going to come down into where, yeah, we would love to have really high frame rates, the fastest possible, but you also have to stick within what the HDMI data throughput is going to allow you to do. Lower spec ports, or not lower spec, but previous gen spec ports don't have the bandwidth for it in some cases. So hopefully that addresses the question about subsampling and why our cameras do 420 10-bit, why there's not the 6K RAW over HDMI in a 3:2 aspect ratio. And then also why we don't do the high res or high frame rate into something like a recorder at this time. It's a lot of this stuff I think is going to eventually come because technology always pushes forward. And as you start to get newer components and newer sensors and newer processing, that's just kind of a natural evolution of things. It's just a matter of where you are in that cycle at this time. So, hopefully that answers your question, and we'll move on to the next one. All right, so this question now is about the APS-C L-mount lenses on cameras like the S5, whether you're using native or adapted. And the question was, about wanting to know if there is a crop mode for the photo side on cameras like the S5. The reason that the question was asked is that the user is seeing severe vignetting when they use it on their S5, but it works perfectly fine on your CL. The lenses that are actually in particular being spoken about are some of the Voigtlander 21mm f4 M mount and the TT Artisan 50mm f1.2L. Voigtlander has an M to L mount adapter, which mounts onto the S5. Vignetting is heavy. Basically, it's a perfect circle. And then the TT Artisan is an APS-C lens, but it only seems to work when the ratio is set to 1:1. So basically here, what you're running into in this case is that, so in the photography mode, there isn't a kind of manual selection to go into an APS-C crop mode on the camera. So what that means is that when you're using a lens like that 21mm, which is designed for not a full frame sensor, you're kind of running into exactly that. You're getting vignetting. If you're basically seeing a circle, that means that lens just does not cover the full frame sensor. Two things you can do with this here. For one, the APS-C mode is going to crop into the sensor anyway, so you can still shoot the camera and know that you're just going to have to crop in, 1.56 or 1.6 or something like that into the image, and that'll get you roughly your APS-C crop. That way of shooting does give you a little bit of a kind of edge too, where you can shoot maybe a little bit more or crop a little bit less than what the traditional crop is going to be to maximize how much of that area of the lens you actually want to use. But yes, it is going to make a little bit more work in post. Typically, what I would do if I was working with a lens that's doing this on the cameras is most likely I'd probably just set up a macro in something like Lightroom or Photoshop and just have it, anytime I bring these images in, just automatically find the crop the way I want it and just automatically have it crop all the images. You're still going to get the same resolution. You're not losing resolution by doing it that way. It's just adding an extra step in post for it. And that's kind of the reason why, if you're looking, it works perfectly fine on your CL because that's a crop censored camera versus the S5, which is full frame. The CL doesn't have to go into a crop mode for it. It just is it's a lens designed for that sensor. What you also see there is the whole conversation that we've had a couple of times about how lenses that are designed for APS-C, even if you can shoot them in this kind of full frame mode, you're going to notice that the edges, you may not really be able to go out as far into the edges of that lens as you're going already with the CL. Because the image quality falls off pretty quickly when you get to the edge of a lens, or edge of the actual projected image area. So yeah, in a case like that with that lens, definitely just kind of play around with it a little bit, see what works best for you. Now the second question here was that the TT Artisan 50 f1.2, it's an APS-C lens versus its big brother, the 50mm f1.4M, which is for full frame. The only workaround you've been able to find is to change the aspect ratio to 1:1. When you do that, you get a square with no vignetting. It was suggested to change Create a Video Combo Set to adjust for this, but I still can't seem to get it to work. So, if you're shooting video, this gets actually really easy. In video, you have a mode called Image Area of Video. So if I go into here and I go up into my second, is the first page? Nope, down here. So image area of video, you see here, it says APS-C, and then there's also a full frame variant. Because I have live crop turned on here, it won't let me do it. So you do have an option in video to use image area of video, and this will allow you to actually set it to be in Super 35, or if you're on an S1H, it'll set it to, S1H will set it to Super 35, S5 will set it to APS-C. It's the same thing. So for video users, this lets you go into that mode and force it there so that you can record. If you're shooting photos, you're basically still going to have to be basically doing, shoot raw. You can either set it in that 1:1 if you want to make sure you've got that, kind of center area so that you're viewing it right. And then being able to know that the raw files that come out of our cameras, you're not stuck with the aspect ratio that you shot with. If you open it up in something like Photoshop or Lightroom, and go into the crop, you'll still have the full image there to play around with the crop mode. But all of this to say that, it is something that we have asked our engineers about, is there a way to just add a crop mode for still shooters, just like what we do for video users, that just lets you use the lower resolution in a Super 35 region or an APS-C region. So seeing this question, sorry I don't have a very, kind of perfect answer for you. It's kind of just a couple more little workarounds for to kind of maximize how you've got it set up. But it is a topic that we have brought up to our team after seeing this question, and actually after seeing a couple questions prior to that as well. So with that, let's move on to the next question. So now on to the i.Dynamic question. So i.Dynamic, it is a mode built into some Lumix cameras, actually all Lumix cameras. And just to get it out there right out of the gate, it's a very simplified kind of mode for shooting with. If you're someone who's going to be doing color editing, if you know that you want to be able to take this footage, bring it into your computer, and do editing to the footage, don't use it. It is in-camera processing for photos and videos that's designed to balance out and maximize dynamic range by boosting shadows in the actual files. So if you at all think that you're going to be using this footage, whether you're in, say, natural or Cine D or Cine V or any of these other profiles, and you turn i.Dynamic on, if you know that you're going to be bringing it into your computer, don't use it. Turn it off. If you want something that you can just quickly shoot and you want to not necessarily worry too much about the overall exposure and how your shadows are versus your highlights, you just want something that really acts like, kind of a point and click option, then yeah, it can be a very useful tool. The different stages of i.Dynamic are designed for just the intensity and how much it's going to, kind of impart on the image. We used to, back in the DSLR days, there were different brands that had these kind of, modes that would help with contrast, help with the different lighting scenarios, and depending on your style of shooting, they could either be incredibly useful or they can be a total nightmare when you actually get the footage and you see, different artifacts or different looks and effects that you weren't necessarily expecting. So, um, the best suggestion that I always try to give with this one is, while yes, I've been saying don't use it, don't use it, don't use it, if you know that you're going to be working with your footage in post, um, that still shouldn't stop you from trying it, playing around with it. There may be a scenario where you shoot and, especially if you're jumping back and forth between photo and video, that you may be working in and it's actually really useful. So play around with it. What it's supposed to do is balance out your highlights and shadows. You'll see as you go through the different steps, it'll raise the shadows a little bit more. If you go too strong with it, you'll start to get weird color casts in the shadows, depending on how far down that shadow was for it to be kind of balancing. But ultimately, think of it as like a tone curve. Like, we offer tone curves in the camera that allow you to actually adjust kind of your contrast. For those that came from, years ago, is the S curve. You can set all those up in the camera, and this is basically just inverting that shadow curve and bringing it up and up and up. Just like in Photoshop, if you take an image and you start playing around with that shadow part of the curve and you start flipping it inverse and raising your shadows, it'll only affect that region, but you start to get some different effects that come from it. Any kind of image manipulation like that, there are going to be trade-offs depending on what you want to do with it. So definitely play around with it. I wouldn't recommend using it in a scenario where you're going to have to do post editing to it, or you think you might have to do post editing to it. In a case like that, if you're using it to try to get a flatter looking image because you want to balance your highlights and shadows out, skip that. Shoot either in something like natural, which is a 709 profile, and it up until recently was kind of one of the most popular shoot and deliver profiles from us, or start working on learning how to shoot with a log profile. Log profiles do take a lot more work to actually get, the product that you want out of them. And you will contend with a little bit more noise just because of how log profiles work. So you have to change how you're exposing. So, kind of play around, see where your comfort level is. Ultimately, I think the important thing is to know that, like, with all of these modes, even if it's a mode designed, as a carry up from some of the point and shoot cameras, they can still find useful times and useful applications in a professional's hands. You may, even if for nothing else, you just want to be able to shoot and not have to necessarily worry about it. That's what a lot of these modes are designed with. Designed to make it easy to shoot something and not necessarily have to always be on thinking about exposure and stuff like that. Sometimes we just want to use our cameras for fun, and you want it to be able to handle it and give you a pretty decently good looking image that you can share with people or just deliver out there. So hopefully that answers the question about i.Dynamic. All right, so now on to probably the biggest question that we got here, and that is, what is the difference between the S1 and the S5, and why would I still want to pick an S1 in 2021 or 2022 when the S5 seems to be getting, a lot of the features that an S1 has? And I mentioned this at the beginning, that a lot of times we get into the habit of just quickly looking at a spec sheet and saying, this camera versus that camera, on specs, they look really close to each other, if not identical in most cases. But we start missing a lot of the kind of intricacies there, and why there is space to have both of these cameras, even though spec-wise they're very, very similar. And I want to touch on some of those, because I think what ultimately is going to make the decision for you is a lot of these smaller features. So while, yes, both cameras can do RAW over HDMI in both Blackmagic RAW and ProRes RAW, it still doesn't make them identical to each other. Because there's a lot of handling differences between these two cameras. There's also a lot of kind of fine detail things that you may not realize you would miss going from one or the other. So to start with, it's going to come down to the stabilization with the cameras. The S5 is a 5.5 stop, or a 5-stop stabilization system, 6.5 with the dual IS system. So if you have one of the LUMIX lenses that has OIS built into it, you can take advantage of the OIS system, which is going to get you up to 6.5 stops. The S1 shipped with 7 stops, and I believe we updated that to around 7.5 stops now. So there is an increase in stabilization with the larger body. Larger body affords you the space and the design area to actually boost up what the stabilization unit can be. So they are different stabilization units between the two cameras. So if handheld stability is something you're looking for, the S1 is going to have a bit of an edge over the S5. So camera to camera, that's a pretty sizable difference. Now, if you're in the photography side of it, while yes, they are the same sensor, you have the same processing in there, the S5 enables you to also be able to do JPEGs with things like high resolution mode. The S5 also has that live view composite that we talked about last week, which is something the S1 doesn't have. So in a photography sense, the S5 could be the better choice for you if those are things that you're actually looking to, kind of make sure are your priorities. If you know that you want to be able to shoot low light and night scenes and astrophotography or light painting, the S5 is probably going to be the better choice for you if you want to take advantage of those tools that we've offered in the camera. Outside of that, the image quality is going to be pretty much the same between the two cameras. Now, when you start looking at the video side, that's where things are a bit different. The S1 does have the SFU2 unlock service for it, which gets you the vlog, the MOV recording, all of that extra level of production there. But it also adds a lot more that the S5 doesn't really get you. So you have different recording options available in the S1. You get, longer time recording capabilities. If you're someone who shoots in 10-bit, the S1 is definitely, hands down, going to be the better option to go with. If 10-bit and, longer form recording is a very important thing to you and that's what you need, go with an S1. It's a larger body. It's designed to handle thermals for a longer set period of time. So hands down, that's the better choice there. Also, if you're someone who shoots with the VFR function or you need high-speed shooting, this is where the S1 again is going to shine. The S1 actually gets you our VFR function versus the slow quick function that's in the S5. That means that the S1 is going to give you a little bit more kind of flexibility in how you actually use your slow quick your variable frame rate functionality, so your high speed recording. So it is going to get you a little bit more flexibility in that case. The other thing to kind of bring up here is just the overall user interface. Uh, Looking between the two cameras, now that the firmware update has come out that kind of balances the autofocus systems between the S1, the S5, and well, actually all the S cameras, the usability is what's going to be different between these cameras. The S1, it is a pro-designed camera, so 400,000 shot rated shutter mechanism. If you're a photographer, that can be a very important spec for you to make sure that you're keeping on top of. The other thing is really going to come down to your actual using experience with this camera. So the viewfinder between these two cameras. You've got a 2360K dot OLED on the S5, and you've got a 5760K dot OLED on the S1. The viewfinder in the S1 is 5.7 megapixel or million pixels. It is a stark difference when you start working with these ultra high resolution viewfinders. If it's something that works for your style of shooting, if you're someone who's constantly using the EVF, you may find that the high resolution is more important to you. Now, that's not to say that the S5's viewfinder is bad. By no means is it bad. I actually like the S5's viewfinder for a lot of the times that I'm shooting. But you start looking at the trade-off there. The S5 is going to be much smaller, so to fit that 5.7K, OLED panel in there probably wasn't really going to work. They also generate heat into the cameras, so you have to manage what components you use properly in the different cameras. But the viewfinder in the S5, it's an awesome viewfinder. If you're someone who's after the resolution and you really need that kind of fine detail with it, the S1 is going to be the better choice for you. You also look at the rear screen. You have the triaxial tilt touch rear screen that we have on the S1 and the S1R. For some people, that's awesome. For someone like myself who shoots with the converted S1R that I use, I love having that screen, that tilt style screen. But there are a lot of times where I will flip over and use my S5, and I really miss having the flip screen. It's just user differences, which is going to work best for your style of shooting. You also come down into the charging and USB ports. The USB port on the S1 is a full-blown 9 volt 3 amp USB-C power delivery port, and you can fully support that over USB-C for full-blown power on the camera. The S5, you run into a little bit more limitations there. USB-C power delivery generates a ton of heat in the cameras. If you've ever charged a mobile device with the fast chargers, you know that you generate heat on the charger and also on the device. So that camera, the S5, it's a standard USB-C power charging port. You also look at the HDMI port. A lot of to-do is made about using a micro Type D port on the S5. And some people are prone to breaking their micro D ports. Personally, I've never broken one, but I'm also not shooting in the same environments as everybody else. The support side of the industry has come a really long way to make, kind of cable supports for making sure that the HDMI port, USB-C port, things like that are securely mounted. But if you're someone who knows that, you need to have that full-size HDMI connection, the Type A connection, the S1 is going to be the camera that you're going to want to go with over the S5. And then, kind of the last thing is really it's down to media. Are you strictly just wanting to use SD cards for your backups and your recording? Or are you someone who wants to, or is okay using things like CF Express? The S1 is going to have the two different types. You have UHS-2 SD cards as well as the one CF Express or XQD card. Though XQD is kind of defunct now. Everything's pretty much moved to CF Express. And that's a whole nother conversation we can have. Where the S5 is going to be a UHS-2 in slot 1 and a UHS-1 in slot 2. So, kind of just the big differences there. Ultimately, between the two cameras, if image quality is what you're looking for, you're not going to go wrong with either of them. It will 100% come down to which camera feels best to shoot with. Which one has the user experience that you're looking for. In a lot of cases, people will prefer a smaller, lighter camera, and some of the time limitations that come with those smaller cameras are easily, kind of gotten around. Things like shooting RAW over HDMI. We've talked about it before. You've got RAW over HDMI, so the time limit thing doesn't really become that big of an issue. I mean, even just shooting ProRes over HDMI, your time limits are not an issue on either of these cameras. So then it comes down to, well, how is the rest of the package put together? Does it work for what you're trying to shoot? How you're trying to shoot? Those are decisions that ultimately are going to come up to your shooting preference. Which one works best for you? I can tell you what my preferences are, but that's not going to mean anything because I'm not you and you're not me. So ultimately, if you have the opportunity, go check them out at a store. If they have an S1, S1R, even an S1H, the S1H is close enough to an S1 to still get you a good, kind of feel between the two cameras because the grip material is the same, the grip size is the same between them. So the S1 the S1H just has a whole bunch of extras on it. But ultimately, if I had to pick one of those cameras between an S1 and an S5 to use on a day-to-day basis for casual shooting, it's an S5. If I'm shooting in a very, kind of high-level professional scenario, it's going to be, for me, it's an S5. But I like the smaller, lighter cameras, and I like the viewfinder on the S5. You may find that it's completely different for you. Get out there if you've got a local photography store around you and they've got them on display. Go in and play with them. That's the biggest piece of advice I can give when it comes to between the two. But yeah, a lot of subtle differences between them that are really more on the user side of the camera, not necessarily the image quality side. So that kind of wraps up a lot of the questions that we had that I wanted to make sure I got to this week. Like I said, I had originally a bunch of stuff planned to shoot for this particular week, but it just made more sense to address the questions that everyone actually spent time in dropping into the comments. We said before, we will be live again next week on Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That's going to be January 6th. Unfortunately and fortunately, as we said before, we won't be physically out at CES anymore, making sure that everyone stays safe, and hopefully everyone out there that's been viewing and watching with us, hopefully all of you are keeping safe, and making it through this next round of craziness that is the world these days. I want to remind everybody about Lumix Pro services here in the United States. We have Lumix Pro Red. If you've got a new camera from the holidays, or if you're getting someone else a new camera, make sure to check out Lumix Pro Services Red. It's free. We have a link down in the description for you to get yourself registered. We'll also have the card pop up. If you're somebody who wants more higher level protection, make sure to check out Lumix Pro Services Platinum. Regardless, you should get yourself on Red one way or another, but Platinum allows you to, couple extra benefits, some nice, solid peace of mind with your equipment from things like sensor cleanings and lens calibrations, all that kind of fun stuff. So we'll have a link down in the description for that as well. If you don't already, make sure to go over and follow us on Instagram. We continue these conversations over there, and I try to get to as many questions as I can that come through our DMs. And we love to see the work produced by anyone out there who wants to share it. So make sure to follow us on Instagram, interact with us over there, tag us in posts if you're really excited about it and you want us to see it. And we may reach out to you and see if it's something that you may want to have us feature. Outside of that, thank you, everybody. I hope everyone had a great holiday season over the last week. I look forward to coming back to everybody in the new year, and I hope everyone has a great new year, and looking forward to, kind of kicking things off again next year. So thanks again. Have a great day, and I'll see you next year.